Today I am covering an incredible woman who was so good at motor racing. She not only got herself banned, but she got women banned from competitive racing events in the US. And you're going to want to stick around for this one because it's both heartbreaking, really frustrating, but also helps us to ignite that fire and that love that we have for so many underrepresented women within the world of motorsport and automotive. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Belinda, an automotive industry expert with almost 9 years experience working with brands from car manufacturers to EV charging software. And I have so much knowledge and so much experience in this industry that I realised one thing is missing. We are missing the stories behind the people, the engineers, the motor racing drivers, the incredible designers who help to bring us the industries that we know and love today. So I'm rectifying that with Belinda Automotive, The Road is Ours podcast. And today I'm incredibly honoured to bring you the amazing Joan Newton Cuneo, who sadly is still remembered as the woman who got women banned from competitive events, but her story is so much more than this. Now, absolute heads up for you, you're gonna want to throw things when you hear what I have to say. You're gonna want to cry at certain points, but you're also going to feel an incredible amount of love for both Joan, her family, and also the women inspired by Joan's story. And the one thing that I absolutely love about Joan Newton Cuneo is just how her legacy continues and her story lasts now. We are talking about this over 100 years after it happened, and she is known as one of the first female pioneers in the motorsport space globally. So without further ado, let's get on with it. Was Joan Newton Cuneo then? Well, before I give you her backstory, I want to say this. She was a woman in America who proved she could not only compete, race wheel to wheel, but also win against some phenomenal male drivers of the early 1900s. And she was backed by an incredibly supportive family who actually withdrew a lot of the Victorian ideals she would have grown up with to actually give her a bit of a fighting chance. And if you think about the early 1900s, of course, we're coming off the back of the Industrial Revolution, which for many of those who don't know, it's sort of the era where we see mass manufacturing, mass production, we see a lot more of the storytelling. Think of Oliver Twist, for example, where you've got children working in the factory floors. It's the start of a time that begins kind of a lot of the capitalist era, where you're starting to build up your societal place, your status, and also where there are serious expectations. One of the things that I absolutely love is if you look at articles from the late 1800s, early 1900s, and you actually see a lot of the same arguments we have today. Like, you see so many people complaining now that young people don't want to work today, and that's exactly what you see in the newspapers from the late 1800s, early 1900s. But we also see some significant differences in the way that women are spoken about or who are talked to within media, within print media particularly. So you'll see things like expectations for women of that time. You'll see that there's always a consensus of what women wear, what is socially acceptable. And this is obviously a time when, if we take ourselves back well over 100 years, it's about 120 years ago, in fact, that one of her key events occurs, that you actually sort of see just how amazing it is at that time. She's pushing boundaries that ended up being set because of the work that she did. And whilst it's been detrimental to women throughout the last, I'd say even up until now, it's had a knock-on effect women being banned from motorsports because of how good they are, you actually see just how far it's put us behind, how we don't have as much funding or sponsorship or support for women. And this is why Joan's story is so important. I personally think that her story just needs to be celebrated, to be talked about more, because she's often just written in the history books as the woman who got women banned. And that's not fair. Joan obviously sets the scene for women now like Susie Wolff, like Jetta Kleinschmidt, like Sabine Schmitz, all of the greats that we've had in recent history. She sets the scene for them. And she builds that stage of what motor racing can be like. Now, we've got some real different kinds of cars that Joan would have driven, such as Locomobiles and Maxwell Speedsters. And I'll show you these on screen now, or if you're watching or listening along, they're essentially, when you go to car, if I think of a museum, if you go to a car museum, it's the ones that look a little bit rickety. They don't look obviously like they would stand up to the test of time like our cars do today. They are very sort of minimal safety, really minimal safety. In fact, you know, you've got your barrier around the outside of your car and that's mostly it. Very tough steering, very challenging to drive, not as fast as our cars go today, but it was more of the thrill of the drive that these cars had. And of course, without the safety aspects in place, without the knowledge or the infrastructure in place, they're actually pretty dangerous. They're really hairy and they're quite challenging to drive. And many of the earlier motor racing days saw increased fatalities just because of the kinds of cars, the lack of experience, the lack of knowledge around what motorsport was and could be, and just how dangerous it was. But it didn't put people off, it didn't put us off, and that's why we've got amazing events today like Extreme E, Extreme H, WRC and Formula One and MotoGP. We've got these incredible series all from this era of development, and that's really where Joan's story starts. So born on July 22nd, 1876 in Holyoke, Massachusetts, Joan grew up in a time where women were expected to be graceful, quiet and almost ornamental in some respects. They had a set expectation of how they would behave in public. They were at that point often seen as their husband's or their father's property. And you would even see things like dowries given in order to hand a woman over during marriage as some kind of, I don't know, contract. And whilst freedoms lacked significantly compared to today, especially compared to where I am in the United Kingdom, there were still opportunities for women to thrive, to gain skills. And of course, for that, women were basically removed from anything mechanical, anything technical, and often anything too social. But there were opportunities, there were chances. But her father actually had a different idea. Besides that, he got rid of a lot of the Victorian ideals that they had grown up with, and actually gave Joan a little bit of a different chance. And this story links so nicely to Michelle Mouton, where we see her father actually back her after she leaves her college law course to go into the Tour de Course in 1972, I think it was, and where he says to her, make it work, try it for a year, make it work, and then buys her first car. So Joan's story really nicely links to Michelle's, because the fathers, again, they changed the expectations and they were there at the beginning to help challenge that. So rather than raising her with Victorian ideals and expectations, he actually raised her to have more independence, to be able to do the hands-on work around their home, and to feel more confident in what she could offer, not just as a woman, but as an individual, as Joan Newton Cuneo. So she learned to handle horses, she became an exceptional horsewoman, and she drove a 6-horse team. And she even learned how to operate a steam train. Again, absolutely incredible, but it sounds so crazy when we think about it now, based on what our thoughts and expectations are of that time. And the confidence that she developed, the way that she refused to limit herself, actually helps to paint her story for what it is today. So I should also state that Joan was one of 4 daughters born to Leila Volte and John Carter Newton. So he in himself, John, her father, was a self-made millionaire and actually treated Joan more like a son than a Victorian woman. And it is claimed that after obviously she's grown up becoming a really skilled horsewoman, a cyclist as well, which I'll cover in a second, they also then decided to try and send her to school to become a Victorian lady. So almost, whether or not that was to try and counteract some of the behaviours that her father allowed her to adopt, or it was to actually help her grow in society. We'll make our minds up about that. But essentially, they gave her every single tool. As bad as it sounds for maybe us today, they not only gave her the tools to be independent, to be competitive, to be ambitious, but they also gave her the tools that would allow her to be socially accepted within that time, which of course was a massive thing for so many women and so many families. Let's cover her competitive eras then. If these stories excite you, why not head to my website, belinda-automotive.co.uk. Before racing cars, Joan was already competitive. She had a love for horse riding and obviously leading the 6-horse team. She was also an accomplished cyclist as well. Again, a mega thing for that time, although it did start to creep in when social mobility became more accepted for women, particularly when we look at bikes and the evolution of electric vehicles in that early era. But she also gained a love for speed, a love for thrill and a love for competition. So in 1898 she married a banker and his name was Andrew Cuneo, so you can see where she changed her name to Joan Newton Cuneo. And a few years later in 1902 he actually had a really similar approach to her father. He bought her something that was so special that actually ended up changing her life. And it was a locomobile steam car. And that car became the beginning of everything for her. As I said at the beginning, she raced Maxwell Speedsters and locomobiles. So she started to gain that confidence, she began to thrive, and that's where a love of motorsport really began and where we start to see some incredible things. Because let me tell you, not only a few years later was she racing in events like Glidden Tour and making an incredible name for herself, winning, but also coming off the back of adversity, crashes and dangerous driving scenarios. Let's not forget that in history, the first road trip had only been a few years shy of this happening, and that was by Bertha Benz. This is what we believe from history. Bertha Benz taking her husband's car from Pforzheim to Mannheim, or Mannheim to Pforzheim, I know she did one to the other, and completing significant kilometres in that car, demonstrating its reliability for the first time ever. But this was still a time where automobiles were seen as novelties. Many people were sceptical. They were still reliant on a horse and cart to get around, and they weren't just, cars at that point just weren't understood as much. It wasn't really clear what their uniqueness was or how they could support everyday life. They were still in early development, and things like speed or range or power, it was all still being understood. But for Joan, this was an incredible opportunity for her, particularly as she started to see amazing opportunities through the cars that she drove, the steam cars, the locomobiles that she enjoyed, and also a real atmosphere around an exciting new sport that hadn't really been embraced by society yet. So she learned the mechanical side of motoring from racer and mechanic Louis Disbrow, who would later become her riding mechanic. Unlike many wealthy motorists or people of status in that era, she wasn't interested in being driven around or having a chauffeur. She was the one who was interested in being sat behind the wheel, in demonstrating the capabilities of these engines, but also, you know, really starting to love them. She's very much like us, a car woman of her era, embracing change, embracing mobility, but also showing opportunities. Like, social mobility back then was a huge thing, not just for the wealthy, but for anyone to get around. Remember, the US, a huge country. The same in the UK, walking or horse and cart, it would take days to get somewhere. Admittedly, in those cars it would also, but it meant something a little bit more different, something a little bit more exciting, and something a little bit more innovative too. She wanted to take how the machines worked. She wanted to understand when they drove, how they failed, but also how they reacted. And the more she practiced, just like all the women we've seen across motorsport history, and as drivers, you know, the more we practice, the better we get, the more confident we get, and the more we understand the hazards that come up against us. But let's remember that at this point in time, power steering, not really a thing. Gears, handbrakes, everything was much more complicated. Rear view mirrors as well, they were not really there. There were so many things that we take for granted today that don't exist back then. Safety, they were heavier, they were harder to drive and maneuver. You know, I don't know if you've ever driven a car that's lost its power steering or had no power steering to start with, but if you've been used to a car with the power steering in place, it can feel a bit like you're trying to drive a brick. That's certainly what I felt when my power steering went in one of my cars. It just suddenly went from a smooth drive to actually being really challenging to handle, because you feel it being so much heavier. And of course, within those early development stages, within those times where cars were challenging, they were unpredictable, they were also very dangerous. We had far less safety features on them, far less than Sabine and Michelle saw when they were racing, and far, far less than we have today, particularly for the race drivers doing your Formula One Academy or your MotoGP. We had far less then, which made it a little bit more fun, but also made the fatality situation even more prominent. So racing, like it does today, required physical strength, incredible knowledge, particularly of tracks or how a car handled, but also the willingness to accept the risk, to accept the fact it could be your most dangerous drive, that you may not come out of it alive. And despite the social expectations put on her at the time, despite what it was meant to be as a Victorian woman, that is not what she did. She didn't just go, no, do you know what, this is not good, not for me, society's going to judge me, blah, blah, blah. She went, do you know what, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to get on with it and I'm going to try it. And an incredible, again, a recurring theme from all the amazing women I've covered so far is that they don't just sit go, oh, you know, let their egos take over. They go, do you know what? Let's just do it. I'm having fun. Let's go. Let's do this. Let's try. And imagine if they hadn't have done that. Imagine if they'd just gone, do you know what? No, society, all right. I need to sit pretty at home and do nothing, or I need to sit pretty at home and be a housewife. We wouldn't have these incredible stories today. But it's thanks to people like Joan that we do. Of course, needing the physical strength, needing the knowledge and the acceptance of risk, Joan had all of that. And Joan was ready to go. And this is the bit I really love next, because we go through to the Glidden Tour breakthrough, and honestly, this is such an exciting time in her career. Before I get into the Glidden Tour era, there's something I want to highlight. As you know, in 1902, her husband bought her the Locomobile. Before that, she'd had 2 children. So to add on top of the fact that this is a woman who is changing boundaries and changing expectations, but she's also a new mum. And They were only 1, 2, 3 years old when she got that car, and when everything started to change. And of course by 1905, her eldest, I think, would have been about 6, 7, depending on when the month they were born. This is actually somebody who is really challenging what it means to be a Victorian woman. Now, some interesting facts as well about the racing mechanic Louis Disbrow is that he had escaped conviction for murder, which I know, right? That is not something you expect to come into it, but he was from a wealthy family as well. And he'd actually been hired by Andrew to support Joan during this period. Louis, knew a lot about automobiles, the mechanics behind it, and he felt like a perfect person to support her in 1905 when she bought her first White Motor Company steam car. And of course, you might then realise that the Glidden Tour comes up. This is where she makes history. But I want to give you one more bit of information. Joan was 5'2". So Joan was quite petite, and compared to many men, there would have been a considerable height difference between them. And of course, her much more petite stature, the way she dressed, and the way she spoke, everything about her would have made her stand out amongst her male competitors, particularly those who have already started to build their name and a career for themselves in motorsport, even though it's in its very early stages. Now, another thing I should state is that both Louis and Andrew had to be supportive of what Joan wanted to do, and they absolutely were. In fact, Andrew attended 3 Glidden tours of Joan's that she entered and was in, and then after a few days he would go off and do his own business affairs because, of course, you know, he's got his things he needs to do. But he was always there, and for several years, he supported her in the racing that she wanted to be in and in the life that she wanted to lead. And of course, he was there to support her alongside the children. Honestly, this is an incredible story because this is exactly what we expect today. We expect support from our other halves, our loved ones, to be able to chase our dreams. So in 1905, the papers in New York were full of automotive events. And of course, these were catching Joan's eye. Now, one of the most prestigious racing events was the Glidden Tour. The Glidden Tour itself was a brainchild of Colonel Jasper Glidden, and it was intended to support automobiles, enhance and demonstrate how reliable they could be, but also just show how they could be put through their paces and how they could prove themselves on the road, even though at that time roads were not paved by any means. They were mostly dirt tracks, sandy paths, gravel, dust. You barely saw tarmacking. Well, you didn't really see any kind of paved roads. There were a lot of cobbled streets if you were in the cities. It was just a real mixture, and we think we've got it bad with all the potholes. But it was a completely different terrain back then. Now, when Joan submitted her application, naturally it was rejected. And it wasn't because she lacked skill, it was actually because she was a woman. And the AAA, which is the American Automobile Association, stated that only male drivers were allowed to compete in the Glidden Tour. Now, of course, we can already assume that Joan herself was outspoken, she was confident, she knew how to present her case. And she actually contested this. She wrote back to them and asked them where it explicitly said that women could not take part in the rules. She was right. It didn't state that women couldn't take part. It didn't state that women were banned. Reluctantly, they let her in. This 5'2" mother who looked every bit not a racing driver in the AAA's eyes, but who is a racing driver consistently in her heart. Now, obviously, the participation itself made history, being a woman entering the space, standing up to those rules, that itself made history. But what she actually did on that tour, on the Glidden tour, honestly, you are going to want to stick around for this because it's incredible what she demonstrated and what she showed. So in 1905, Joan Newton Cuneo entered the Glidden tour with 3 passengers by her side. Her husband Andrew, the mechanic Louis Disbrow, and his sister, and they all set off in the white motor steam car that I mentioned earlier. And there were several of these cars that had entered the Glidden tour, including one driven by the president of the White Car Company. And what happens next, through thick and thin, through the dangerousness of the road and the excitement of the track, Joan Newton Cuneo manages to do something absolutely amazing. So stay tuned. So in the 1905 Glidden tour, with her 3 passengers, her husband, the mechanic and his sister, something interesting happens and she crashes. But hear me out, this is not just she entered, crashed and oh, nothing, you know, she didn't succeed, nothing happened. She actually adapted something really interesting. So as they're getting used to the Glidden tour on the first day, they enter a narrow bridge, which is basically what the articles, what a lot of the recollections from that time describe. And in front of her is another car. Now, just to pause for a second and to give you a bit of context here, cars during that point didn't have rear lights. They didn't really have a whole lot of technology behind them like we have now. No deflectors, no rear lights, no brake lights. It was very much a react scenario. You had to gauge how other drivers in front of you were behaving. Now, as she's coming up to this narrow bridge, this other driver from history stops and reverses back, almost as if they are going to try and avoid the bridge, or they're going to try and manoeuvre themselves over it a bit more cautiously, but for whatever reason they stop suddenly. And that makes Joan, as the driver, have to react to that, which causes the crash. She tries to manoeuvre and evade that car as best as she can, trying to get around it. But unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of room for her to do so. The wheels of the car ended up heading off of the bridge, and both the car and the passengers ended up falling off the bridge and landing in a stream below. Now, rather than Joan holding her hands up and saying, right, that's it, we're done, we tried, it was our best, never mind, let's go, she doesn't do that. And in fact, she keeps going. She tries something different. The thing to know about the White Car Motors is that they were considered sturdy cars of the time. So after some nearby bystanders helped them to right the vehicle, get it back into position, get it back on the road, get it back roadworthy, I should say. And they were supported by people working in the area as well. The car actually started again. And it meant that they could continue on. So fortunately enough, the passengers basically came out pretty unharmed, a few bruises, maybe a slight bit of soreness, really lucky. And after the car was righted and they managed to get it back up and starting again, Joan drove it out of the ditch that it was in and they continued on their way. Now, of course, the Glidden tour is several days. Now, the Glidden tour was designed to cover hundreds to 1,000 miles on tricky roads, and as I said earlier, it was designed as a way to prove the reliability of these cars. So the first day this accident happens, this crash happens, as she comes off the bridge, and obviously the car has several days of driving, and unfortunately on the last day the car being battered, broken at its wit's end, I'd say. It's gone through a lot. It's gone through a lot of endurance and also the crash. It does eventually give up. And whilst that's what I was saying earlier about, despite, you know, the history being made here for her entering as a woman, but also the crash itself ended up in headlines and newspapers just about how she kept going, how the car came off and then it kept going until the last day when unfortunately it gave out, and mechanically it couldn't continue. But that started a bit of a theme for her, because after having taken part in that Glidden tour, there was then the speed breakthroughs and so many other things that she achieved, particularly along the Glidden tour itself and Atlantic City races. Now, after having her name known in the newspapers, and shortly after the event, Andrew and Joan returned home and they were contacted quite promptly by several newspapers encouraging them to take part in the Atlantic City races in New Jersey. So she arranged for her car to be shipped out, ready to take part in the race itself. After shipping her car to the beach, she entered a race over Labor Day weekend in September 1905, and it was a 1 mile race, just designed to do a bit of a sprint really. And she came in second, so she managed to prove herself. Second place is incredible. Different track, different style of driving, different handling, and she started to really make a name for herself. And after having competed at Atlantic City, she then went on later in the month to race and travel to the Dutchess County Fair in Poughkeepsie in New York for what would become basically her first real taste of track driving. And even though the day itself came with a lot of frustration, a lot of irritation, and probably a lot of maybe obstacles in her way and friction, Joan actually described it as a day that she truly fell in love with the world of motorsport and the sport itself. She described it as feeling like love at first sight when she was on the track, when she was racing, when she was there. And it's safe to say that from these events, the smaller events, to being asked to attend by journalists, that her love grew and grew and grew, and she realised that there was a talent there. There was something there that she could really harbour and really enjoy. And it was around that same time that she also met the legendary driver Barney Oldfield for the first time. And results-wise, the day itself at Poughkeepsie was mixed, but honestly, for her to feel like it was a real eye-opener and a real opportunity for her to fall in love with the sport is incredibly uplifting and heartwarming, particularly for her story and knowing where she starts and how she gets there. If you love content like this, but you just need it a bit shorter, I'm across all your favourite social media platforms, so simply search Belinda Automotive and you'll find so many other stories that I've already covered. Why did it all feel frustrating? So on the day of the race, she was really disappointed with her exhibition mile, which she completed in 1 minute and 22.5 seconds, as she was attempting to set a women's speed record. At the same time, she had mechanical failures she had to deal with, which forced her out of the 5 mile handicap race against male competitors. So she couldn't finish, and I think that's what made her feel so frustrated, but I think it gave her a bit of an eye-opener as to what motorsport is truly like, and that it's not all uphill. You have to overcome problems and issues and obstacles, and that's certainly what she demonstrated during that point. I do have to add this point in, which this actually made me chuckle when I read and researched this. But of course, after the Glidden tour, after Atlantic City, after Poughkeepsie, she obviously had the frustration that she expressed. She had the mechanical failure. She wasn't happy with the exhibition time that she set during her mile race. And on the way home, after having fixed up the car, after having got back on the road, she was then arrested for speeding. And it made me chuckle because, I don't know, whether or not this actually then encouraged her to set more records, I don't know, or if she was just so cross that she just ended up, I don't know, putting her foot down and just wanting to get home. For her, it kind of feels really fitting in her story that after all of that issue and the controversy and the problems, that she then gets arrested for speeding on her way home. Despite being arrested for speeding in 1906, Joan was still competing, still driving single mile tracks, still competing on oval tracks. She was trying to improve her speed, her stamina, her endurance, and also she started, I think, getting a bit inspired about how she could break some of those records and start setting them. And the tracks that she was practicing on were basically built for horses. So again, very slippery, very sticky, very challenging to handle, especially if the cars were too heavy or they dug into the ground. And it would all be about not just how she could build up speed, build up momentum, but how she could recover when a car sunk or when things didn't quite turn out right when she was going around a corner. Or she also competed in gymkhanas, which was an obstacle style driving events, and they tested precision as much as speed. And she continued building a reputation for being fearless behind the wheel and representing exactly what women could do. She was the first piece of representation for so many women during that time, and even now when we look back on how it was even possible. And then at the Danbury Fair in 1906, her reputation was once again tested in a dramatic fashion when her car caught fire. And while she was driving at speed with 2 female passengers on board, now of course the passengers jumped clear immediately, but we know Joan by now. She had to have a reaction. She had to do something. So Joan stayed with the car long enough to shut off the engine and cut the fuel before she managed to escape herself. She suffered burns and she singed her hair in the process, but she showed and demonstrated exactly what she could do, and she kept pushing and pushing, and she started to really understand the risks, the dangers that came from motor racing of this kind. And that's some of the parts where people realise she wasn't just a gimmick or a novelty. She was a serious racing driver who understood the risks, who was prepared to take them, but also who was prepared to understand and react to them as well, which really solidified her as one of the pioneers when it came to motorsport start in the early 1900s. And by 1907, she was proving herself in even bigger events, pushing herself further and taking herself to that next limit, that next level, where she could really highlight and be that representation for so many women and so many people who were interested in the world of motorsport and to purely enjoy it. So she was finishing third in a 100-mile race driving a Rainier, and she completed it in just over 2 hours. That was 1907, and then 1908 came, which is one of the most pivotal years of her racing career. So during this point, she was driving for the Rainier Motor Company, and she competed the Glidden Tour with a perfect score. Thinking back to when she was in the white motor company car, how she had to react, how she had to adapt. She's practiced, she's had years on this, and now she's taken it, got a perfect score within the Glidden Tour. She's starting to really highlight herself as a serious contender. It was a major achievement in one of the toughest motoring events in the country, and she was actually awarded a large sterling silver plate in recognition of her performance. And she was shining, she was proving she could, and I really feel like she was probably in her era, she was in her element, she was living in the moment and really appreciating and enjoying what she could do and falling more and more in love with the motorsport and the cars that she was driving. But then in 1909, change came. In 1909, she entered the Mardi Gras, which was a territory really highlighted as belonging to men, a race that belonged to male drivers, that it was really just suitable for male drivers, a lot of that rhetoric that came alongside it. And she effectively proved that she wasn't there to symbolise women in racing. She, again, wasn't a gimmick. She wasn't just there to be like a mascot or anything like that. She was a real contender. She was somebody who showed up, who proved she could, and who came to compete. And she was really there to win. And during that time, she beat some of the biggest names in American racing, like Bob Berman and George Robertson. And in one of the most famous results of her career, she finished second in a 50-mile race behind only Ralph De Palma, who was one of the fastest drivers during that time and one of the greatest. And it proved that she wasn't a novelty. She was there to compete. She was there to prove herself. And she was ultimately there to win. And she became elite competition, just like Michelle, just like Sabine. She proved that she was just as worthy as her male counterparts. Despite having the backing of her husband at the time, Andrew, the support of her mechanic, Louis, and the hearts of so many people across the nation, she had journalists reach out to her. She became so much more understanding of not only how to race a car, but the mechanics of it. She became familiar with changing tyres, and there are so many photos of her basically taking a lot of the mechanical components of automobiles and doing them herself. But this is where, right around the time of the Mardi Gras, where amongst the excitement, having come so close to racing up against Ralph, who was considered one of the greatest drivers of the time, the AAA, the American Automobile Association, promptly announced a ban on women entering competitive racing events. And of course, to Joan, this felt very personal, because many of the men that she had known who were part of the AAA, some she was very familiar with, had turned her away, had stuck their nose up at her, had rejected her whenever she had wanted to enter an event. So she knew it was really tough to get an audience with them to prove that they were wrong, despite the incredible work that she had done to prove herself as a driver, to prove her talent. And whilst it's not so noted at the time about Joan being a ambassador or anything for women's rights, like the suffragette movement or anything like that, she did truly believe that women should be allowed to compete if they showed the ability and the desire to do so, and that without having women within the talent pool, it basically made it not as diverse or as exciting. And unfortunately, at one point, Joan even thought about taking the AAA to court, but she realised that their decision was closing ranks on her, and actually she would end up losing out on the battle. Which, of course, say what you will about the AAA doing it, but many have said that they felt threatened by such an incredible driver being female. Many have also said that they felt she wasn't given a fair playing field by having that decision taken away. And many others also believe that they probably had their egos hurt a little bit. I mean, the AAA of the time had tried to reject women without there being anything in writing. So it's not hard to consider that maybe when she pulled them up for it the first time, when she entered the Glidden Tour, that they were finding ways to ban women completely. And before I go on to her, actually, what she does after breaking records, and then her later parts of life, what I want to highlight here is decisions like this that were made by people who didn't appreciate the talent and the ability of women actually meant that they reduced the visibility of women in the sport altogether. And it's these kinds of decisions, these attitudes, these ways of thinking about how women compete that basically unleveled the playing field. It meant that it was always in favour of male drivers participating. And then obviously, as we know in motorsport, it's male drivers who had a lot of money. or a lot of funding or a lot of sponsorship, and it's only the rare one or two, like handful of drivers that actually come from underprivileged backgrounds that break through and really have to push hard. So there was already something in it that meant that women were pretty much not able to compete. Either they were not allowed because of the bans, or they didn't come from that privileged background that allowed them to be nurtured into a motorsport career. Even people like Michelle Mouton, whose father stood behind her to help her get into motorsport, had that same amount of sexism and misogyny about her being a female driver. And in all honesty, it just clearly shows the, dare I say, the vulnerability that these people feel if they feel like they can't compete against women. And actually, I've said it for the longest time, I think it's about time that we prepared. It doesn't matter if we go into these races and we lose, but it doesn't matter if we go into these races and we win. It's an opportunity for us to level the playing field again and to actually start building experience. So by the next 20, 30, 40 years, we've got a diverse driving team, not just those who have come from a privileged background, but those who have been nurtured through grassroots, who have been supported, whether they are female, male, or identify within the LGBTQ community. It doesn't matter. We should all be allowed to compete if we choose, accept the risks, but obviously go through the stamina, the endurance. You can't just compete if you don't know what you're doing. You obviously have to go through that rigorous testing, but it's about time that we gave people a chance to compete without creating any boundaries, don't you think? So despite the devastation of the ban, Joan refused to disappear. In fact, during that time, she ended up looking more into how she could enhance her speed and how she could create some speed records that kept her love of motorsport going, but without obviously entering those competitive events which were taken from her. So in 1911, she set what is often recognised at the time as being one of the fastest speeds achieved, recorded by a female driver. Now, she reportedly reached around 111 to 112 miles per hour on the Long Island Motor Parkway. And she kept her knowledge of the cars, she obviously kept building up the momentum to start setting those speed records. This is a woman that has lost the competition that she loves, but she's not allowing some of the aspects of it to be taken away from her. She's clutching onto it as best she can. And there's not much that she could have done at this point. There's not much she could have argued against, because these were really influential men that were offended by her incredible talent. And she couldn't have done much without, short of them agreeing that they were threatened by her capabilities. Obviously, having been pushed away from a sport that she loved, and being a woman, trying this as well on her own, or, with few people knowing, or with limited support, she was still trusted with some of the most dangerous and challenging machinery of the era to be able to achieve speeds like 111, 112 miles per hour, which may not sound like a lot, but in the cars and the automobiles that she was driving, that was some serious foot down speed. That was some serious skill to be able to build the car up, to be able to keep it going, to handle it, to try not to reduce the speed in any way. It took a lot for her to do that, and it would be challenging, and would have been challenging for any driver during that point, particularly with cars that had limited power steering, if not no power steering at all, and just really heavy vehicles that take a minute to get off of the line. It's not a foot down, off you go. She had to build up that momentum and that understanding behind it. And of course, that said everything, that she was respected enough to work with those much more heavy duty machines. It said a lot within motorsport, and respect itself goes a long way. We've seen it in the paddocks where visibility is reputation and reputation is respect. And for her to have that respect, despite being in an era that was strongly against her having that freedom, is incredible, particularly with the notoriety of who she was, what she'd achieved during her time as a racing driver, and how she got there. Despite the ban from the AAA, she still competed in events that weren't sanctioned by the American Automobile Association. She set unofficial speed records with that ban in place. Many didn't want to recognise her, and it's sad. It's sad because she was an incredible driver, but she didn't, although it was a massive blow to her, it was a sport that she loved, she tried to use it to the best and do something good with that. So at the time, obviously, as I mentioned throughout, the roads, comparable to the potholes we see today, theirs were probably worse. Gravel tracks, dirt tracks, cobbled streets, uneven roads. There were so many accidents, collisions, mechanical failures due to the type of roads out and about. So she worked on campaigns to help improve the roads, make them last longer, make them much easier to drive, and thereby enhance the social mobility. If people are going to go on long drives, nowadays, you want to know that you're probably going to be sticking to some really easy roads to drive. If you're not a confident driver, going on country lanes is a bit of a challenge. So for drivers back then to know that they had roads that were suitable for their cars was a huge deal. And she was pivotal in helping support that campaign, writing articles for that campaign, and improving the overall road system in the US. But despite all that, and the saddest thing, the most heartbreaking thing, is that she would never again have an opportunity to compete in a sport that she loved against male counterparts who, no doubt, she probably had a good relationship with some of them, and others who probably were a bit offended that she was there, but she lost that. She had that taken away from her because of the feelings of the AAA and their opinions at the time, which we know today are wrong, but back then they had no other way of explaining it. That was what society expected, and challenging society kind of put you as a bit of an outcast. So it was the status quo when you look at it. Obviously, she had quite a glamorous life. Her husband was a banker, but after the whole thing that happened, that also came to a bit of a halt. His business had problems. Their marriage ended in divorce. And unfortunately, it was due to her husband's scandalous affair with a showgirl at the time. And of course, that could have only been a big defeat as well for Joan. And it's just thinking about it now for her, I hope that there was some good that came out of it, that she could see the good that came out of it. But of course, different times now compared to then. By 1916, she no longer made the national news. Her and her daughter moved to Deerfield in Vermont. And then in 1923, she had a bit of good luck where she followed her childhood love, James, to a small town in Michigan. That's where she lived until she passed away in 1934. She eventually married him and became part of the Sickman family, which was his surname. And she became more heavily involved in the local community, in women's work, so to speak, within that area. The saddest part, the saddest part is that her obituary, when she passed away, had no mention of her racing career. It was almost as if it was a chapter that was closed and she'd started living a different life. I'd hate to think that it was a painful period for her, that she had to let go of it. But, I mean, we've all been through those moments where something has happened, causing us to have to stop doing something we love or being with somebody we love. And I just hope that it wasn't that for her, but we can only assume, we can only guess. When she did die, there was just a brief mention of it in the New York Times. It's not been 100 years since her death. It's been 90 odd years. But she's had such a pivotal point in motorsport for women and in developing a lot of the motorsport ways. So many people have learned from the mechanical failures she experienced, from the fires she experienced. And I think it's important to note that she is no longer just the woman who got women banned, because actually behind the context, she's the woman who dared to try. So after the ban from competing in organised events, to her husband going through a scandalous affair with a showgirl, to eventually moving away from New York and Long Island and heading up to Michigan to be with her childhood sweetheart. I think there's so much that we can take from Joan's story, and just how incredibly talented she was as a driver, as a person. She broke barriers, she challenged expectations, she really pushed societal ideologies and ideas to the limits. And although I hate to say it, it might just have been that during her time, she had to be the one, to be the trailblazer, to be the first, to be the person that highlighted the problems that these male-only sports meant for women. And whilst we ended up having a huge kickback from it for decades and decades because of the AAA's choice, no fault of Joan at all, it's pushed so much back. But there are so many things that we can learn from her story. And I think we would be doing her a disservice if we just stopped talking about our roots and where it began. Because Joan's story is really one of the first that highlights the misogyny and the sexism that appears in the motorsport and automotive realm. It's the first where many can't use their words to explain exactly what the problem is with women competing. We saw the same with Michelle Mouton when, during her Pikes Peak hill climb, she was berated and ridiculed by journalists and people who believed that she shouldn't have been there simply because she was female. So it's a great time for us to learn and reflect on where we are, what's happening. It's not doom and gloom at all, because Joan's story has helped to propel movements like the Formula One Academy, More Than Equal, other organisations that support girls in grassroots racing, and in supporting women in getting into the automotive industry, in encouraging women to go and get their car serviced or learn those skills for themselves. We've got some incredible women across our industry who, though they may not have known Joan's story, could have built that pathway because of the things that Joan has done, and many like Joan have done. There is just so many positives that we can take from Joan's story, despite the fact that it's just ridiculously unfair that she never got to finish and compete and keep competing after, after that second place. And I'm still speechless about what has happened to her. But the fact now that we have those opportunities, we can use Joan's story as a lesson, and we can start to build that vocabulary about what the exact problem is with women competing in sports like this, because there's no problem. It's just that through decades and through history, with being pushed back, societal expectations, lack of visibility, lack of funding, women haven't been able to build up as much of the skills or the support to be able to get onto the track. We see at some point in the future, I'll cover Cheryl Lynn Glass, who she couldn't afford to get on the track, so she had to be creative about selling ceramic dolls to get herself there. Similarly for Michelle, she had the backing of her father to help her get there. But without him buying her the Alpine A110, would that have been possible? There are just so many what ifs that we have from history, but we just have to remember that we're here now. We're able to compete now. We're able to do incredible things now. We've just celebrated Dorian Pin becoming the first female to drive a Formula One Mercedes car. We're celebrating those wins and those breakthroughs, and they may feel like they're coming late. But if we dwell on the fact that they're coming late, it only puts us back further. So here, we've changed Joan's story today. We've changed her from the woman who got women banned from organised events. And we've actually outlined every single thing that she did in order to make her career great, her motor racing love incredible, but also how she probably inspired her children. She probably inspired so many women and even people that never thought they could get into the world of motorsport, whether they were male or female at that time, I think there's so many incredible things that we can talk to, like and we look at her counterpart Dorothy Levitt racing in the same way but in the UK and under factory-backed sort of teams, if you like. There's just so many incredible things that Joan's story can help us do, can remind us, but also to highlight that actually, if it's your dream, try it. And really, the only thing that got in Joan's way was society. And nowadays, that should not be a problem. And the more we raise awareness, the more we educate, the more we tell incredible stories of women and girls in the automotive and motorsport space, the more we can encourage the next generations, the women of my generation who never thought they could, the women of older generations who still want to try. Let's be honest, like, we've had amazing women driving cars in their 80s, like racing in their 80s and their 70s, but we don't hear those stories, and we're kind of told that we have to stop at a certain point, that menopause hits and life is over, and it's not. So I'd love to hear, what have you taken from Joan's story? Are you somebody that always wanted to but never tried and now you feel like it's too late? I want to hear it. Comment it below, because I honestly think that there is such a space for us across the industry. Whether you're female, male, within the LGBTQ community, there is so much opportunity for us all out there, and we just have to keep telling those stories. So let me know what you think about Joan's story, and if you want me to cover a particular woman, or if there's somebody you'd like me to interview, drop their name, tag them below for me, and I'll go and see if I can get some time in with them. I know that these incredible people are so busy, but I want to share their stories, because why not? It's important to raise that awareness, and after all, the road is ours. I'll see you next time, and take care, and I hope that you'll all feel inspired by Joan's story and you share it across the world, because there are incredible things that can happen from raising awareness of such an incredible woman in history.